The ridge line cut against the Afghan sky like a serrated blade, and Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez pressed his eye to the scope one more time. 3 hours. 3 hours they'd been watching the valley below, where Taliban fighters moved between compounds like ants rebuilding after rain. The mission was supposed to be simple: observe, report, exfiltrate. But intel had been wrong about the numbers. Dead wrong. This is Overwatch 6, Rodriguez whispered into his radio, voice barely audible above the mountain wind. We've got approximately 60 hostiles in the valley. Repeat, 60 hostiles with heavy weapons. Request immediate extract. Static crackled back. Overwatch 6, extraction not available for another 4 hours. Maintain position. Rodriguez exchanged glances with his team. Petty Officer Johnson's jaw tightened. Corpsman Williams checked his medical kit for the third time in 10 minutes. They all knew what those numbers meant. 60 Taliban fighters with mortars and machine guns versus 4 SEALs with limited ammunition on an exposed ridge. The math was simple and terrifying. Then came the sound that changed everything. It started as a whisper, barely distinguishable from the wind threading through the mountain passes, but Rodriguez knew aircraft engines. This wasn't the familiar thrum of a Black Hawk or the rotor chop of an Apache. This was something else: twin turbofan engines, low and getting lower. The sound built gradually, echoing off canyon walls in a way that made it impossible to determine direction. "You hear that?" Johnson asked, scanning the sky with his binoculars. The Taliban fighters in the valley had noticed too. Rodriguez watched through his scope as they scrambled for cover, some pointing skyward, others running toward the tree line. Whatever was coming, they were afraid of it. The engine noise grew louder, reverberating through the mountains like distant thunder. Rodriguez felt it in his chest now, that deep thrumming that spoke of serious air power approaching. But from where? The valley was a box canyon with only one way in, a narrow pass between towering peaks that even the most experienced pilots avoided in daylight, let alone in the gathering dusk. "Overwatch 6, this is Hawkeye 2-1, a voice crackled over the radio. Female, calm, almost conversational. "I understand you boys have found yourselves in a bit of trouble down there." Rodriguez keyed his radio, still scanning the empty sky. "Hawkeye 2-1, Overwatch 6, we have eyes on you." He paused, realizing how that sounded. "I mean, negative visual on your aircraft." A soft chuckle came through the static. "Oh, you will." Captain Lydia Reaper Castellanos banked her. Thunderbolt II through the mountain pass at 300 feet above ground level. Her aircraft's titanium bathtub groaning under 5 GS as she threaded the needle between granite walls that scraped past her wingtips with mere meters to spare. The pass was barely wider than her aircraft's 47-foot wingspan, and she was flying it in twilight with nothing but night vision and 23 years of flying experience keeping her alive. Most pilots called this pass the meat grinder. Castellanos called it Tuesday. Her heads-up display painted the terrain in ghostly green lines, but she barely glanced at it. She knew every rock formation, every wind shear, every thermal updraft in this particular corner of hell. She'd been flying close air support missions in Afghanistan for 8 months now, longer than most of her squadron combined, and she'd learned to read the mountains like a book written in stone and snow. "Overwatch 6, what's your situation down there?" she asked, her voice steady as she pulled 4 more GS coming out of the pass, the valley opening up before her like a target-rich environment painted by the gods themselves. "Hawkeye 2-1, we've got approximately 60 hostiles with heavy weapons in the valley below us. We're taking sporadic fire but holding position. Coordinates follow." Rodriguez's voice was tight but professional. Castellanos smiled grimly as the coordinates populated on her display. The SEALs were pinned down on the northern ridge, exactly where she'd expected them to be. Intel always got the numbers wrong, but they were usually right about where the shooting started. She rolled her aircraft inverted and pulled the stick back, diving toward the valley floor at a 70-degree angle. The altimeter unwound like a slot machine paying out death. 4,000 feet, 3,000, 2,000. The Taliban fighters below scattered like startled birds, but there was nowhere to run in the narrow valley. At 1,000 feet, she rolled upright and triggered her targeting pod. 60 heat signatures bloomed on her display, most of them clustered around the three main compounds. But she could see others moving toward the ridgeline where the SEALs waited. Time was running short. Overwatch 6, I see your friends. Recommend you make yourselves very small for the next few minutes. Rodriguez's voice came back immediately. Roger that, Hawkeye 2-1. We're buttoned up tight. Castellano selected her 30 GAU-8 Avenger cannon and lined up her first strafing run. 4,200 rounds of depleted uranium waited in her aircraft's belly, each one capable of punching through tank armor. What it would do to human targets wasn't something she liked to think about, but thinking about it had never been part of the job description. The A-10 had been built around its gun, designed specifically to kill Soviet tanks on European battlefields that would never see war. Instead, she found herself in Afghan valleys, protecting American soldiers from an enemy that hid in compounds and caves. It wasn't what the aircraft had been designed for, but it was what the mission required. She pulled the trigger. The GAU-8 cannon erupted with a sound like the world's largest chainsaw, sending a stream of depleted uranium rounds into the largest compound at 65 rounds per second. The building disintegrated in a cloud of dust and debris, secondary explosions blooming as ammunition stores detonated. The characteristic BRRRT sound of the cannon echoed off the valley walls, a noise that had earned the A-10 the nickname Warthog, and struck fear into enemy forces across 3 decades of warfare. "Holy shit," Johnson whispered from the ridgeline, watching through his binoculars as the compound ceased to exist. She just deleted that building. But Castellanos was already setting up her second pass, banking left and pulling GS that would have incapacitated most pilots. The remaining Taliban fighters were running now, abandoning their positions and fleeing toward the tree line. She could have let them go, mission accomplished, SEALs safe. Instead, she rolled inverted and dove again. This wasn't about the mission anymore. This was about sending a message. The second compound died in a hail of 30 rounds, its mud brick walls no more resistant to depleted uranium than tissue paper. Castellanos pulled up hard, her aircraft climbing at 30 degrees, and keyed her radio. Overwatch 6, this is Hawkeye 2-1. I count 47 hostiles neutralized. Remaining personnel appear to be withdrawing from the area at high speed. Jesus Christ, Rodriguez breathed. Hawkeye 2-1, that was incredible. Who the hell are you? Silence for a moment, then, just someone who doesn't like bullies. But as she climbed toward her patrol altitude, Castellanos could hear other voices on the radio frequency. Her squadron mates back at Bagram Air Base, and they weren't celebrating her success. They were questioning her judgment, her tactics, her decision to engage without authorization from higher command. Hawkeye 2-1, this is Falcon Actual. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Colonel Bradley Morrison, her squadron commander. You are ordered to return to base immediately for debrief. Castellanos felt the familiar knot forming in her stomach. She'd saved 4 SEALs from certain death, eliminated a significant Taliban presence from a strategic valley, and completed the mission with textbook precision. But somehow, she knew she was about to be the one in trouble. Roger, Falcon Actual, Hawkeye 2-1 returning to base. She banked toward Bagram, leaving the valley quiet except for the crackling of fires and the distant sound of the SEALs calling in their extraction. Behind her, the mountains swallowed the sound of her engines, and the sky began its slow fade toward night. The debriefing room at Bagram Air Base smelled like stale coffee and disappointment. Castellanos sat at attention in front of a table occupied by 3 men whose combined flight time didn't equal half of hers, listening to them explain why saving 4 SEALs had been the wrong decision. Captain Castellanos, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison began, his voice carrying the particular tone reserved for subordinates who had embarrassed their superiors. Your actions today violated standing rules of engagement. You engaged targets without authorization from ground control or higher command. Sir, the SEALs were in immediate danger. They requested close air support, and I was in position to provide it. They requested extraction, corrected Major Peterson, Morrison's executive officer, not a unilateral strike on multiple targets. Castellanos kept her face neutral, but inside she was burning. Peterson had exactly 47 hours of combat flight time, most of it in the relative safety of high-altitude patrols. He'd never had to thread an A-10 through mountain passes or watch American soldiers die while waiting for permission to help them. Sir, with respect, 60 Taliban fighters with mortars and heavy machine guns constituted an immediate threat to American personnel. The rules of engagement clearly state. The rules of engagement, Morrison interrupted, clearly state that you will receive authorization before engaging targets. You went off script, Captain, again. Again, there it was. Castellanos had been hearing that word a lot lately. Again when she'd provided close air support to a Marine patrol without waiting for approval. Again when she'd pursued fleeing insurgents beyond her assigned patrol area. Again when she'd landed at a forward operating base to deliver medical supplies that weren't technically her responsibility. The problem wasn't her flying. Everyone agreed she was the best pilot in the squadron, possibly the best A-10 pilot in theater. The problem was that she kept acting like she was there to win a war instead of following procedures. Captain, Morrison continued, I'm recommending you for a fitness for duty evaluation. Your recent actions suggest a pattern of insubordination and poor judgment that may be indicative of combat stress. Combat stress. Castellanos almost laughed. These men thought she was cracking under pressure when the truth was exactly the opposite. She'd never been more clear about her purpose, never been more focused on what needed to be done. The Taliban were killing American soldiers, and she had the tools to stop them. Everything else was just paperwork. Sir, request permission to speak freely. Morrison's expression suggested this was the last thing he wanted to hear. Granted. Those SEALs are alive because I engaged those targets. If I'd waited for authorization, we'd be having a very different conversation right now, possibly at a memorial service. That's enough, Captain. Morrison's voice carried a warning. You're dismissed. Report to the flight surgeon tomorrow at 800 for your evaluation. Castellanos stood and saluted, her movements sharp and precise. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of herself in the room's mirror, 34 years old, 5'6", with calloused hands and eyes that had seen too much. She looked exactly like what she was, a warrior in a bureaucracy, a predator in a cage of regulations and risk management. Outside the debriefing room, the Afghan night was cool and clear, stars scattered across the sky like shrapnel from some cosmic explosion. Castellanos walked toward the flight line, where her A-10 waited in its revetment, ground crew already preparing it for the next day's missions. The aircraft looked different in moonlight, less like a machine and more like a sleeping beast, dangerous even in repose. She'd been flying A-10s for 8 years now, ever since flight school at Columbus Air Force Base. The aircraft had chosen her as much as she'd chosen it, something about the way she understood its brutal simplicity, its complete dedication to a single purpose. The A-10 was ugly, slow, and obsolete by most measures. It was also incredibly tough, surprisingly maneuverable, and absolutely lethal when pointed at the right targets. Like its pilot, Sergeant Maria Santos, her crew chief, approached with a clipboard and a concerned expression. Captain, heard about the debrief. Everything okay? Santos had been working A-10s longer than Castellanos had been flying them, and she understood the aircraft, and its pilots with an intimacy that came from years of keeping both alive. She was also one of the few people on base who treated Castellanos like a competent officer instead of a problem to be managed. "Everything's fine, Santos. How's the bird?" "Clean bill of health. Barely used any ammo today, only 400 rounds. Must have been good shooting." Castellanos smiled. "Good targets." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, looking at the aircraft. The A-10's nose art was barely visible in the moonlight, a grim reaper in aviator sunglasses, holding a scythe in one hand and a 30 cannon shell in the other. Below it, in precise lettering, was her call sign, Reaper. She'd earned that call sign during her first deployment to Iraq, when she destroyed 17 armored vehicles in a single mission. The name had followed her through 3 combat tours and 2 continents, becoming as much a part of her identity as her rank or her wings. Some pilots changed call signs between squadrons or deployments. Castellanos wore hers like armor. "You know what I don't understand?" Santos asked, still looking at the aircraft. "What's that?" "They're worried about you being too aggressive. But every pilot I've ever worked with, the really good ones, they all had to be held back, not pushed forward. The ones who needed pushing never lasted long enough to get good." Castellanos nodded. Santos understood something that the men in the debriefing room never would. In combat, hesitation killed more people than aggression ever had. The sky didn't care about your fitness reports or your adherence to procedure. It only cared whether you were fast enough, smart enough, and ruthless enough to survive. "Get some sleep, Santos. Big day tomorrow." "Yes, ma'am, you too, Captain." But sleep was the last thing on Castellanos' mind as she walked back toward her quarters. Tomorrow would bring the flight surgeon's evaluation, more questions about her judgment, more suggestions that she needed help or rest or a different assignment. What it wouldn't bring was any acknowledgement that she'd saved 4 lives today, or that she'd done it with the kind of flying that most pilots only dreamed about. The truth was, she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she'd been trained to do. Everything else was just noise. 3 days later, Castellanos sat in the flight surgeon's office, answering the same questions she'd been answering for the past 72 hours. Yes, she was sleeping well. No, she wasn't experiencing unusual stress. Yes, she understood the rules of engagement. No, she didn't feel her judgment was impaired. Dr. Rebecca Martinez was a competent psychiatrist and a former Air Force pilot herself, which made the conversation both easier and more frustrating. Martinez understood the pressures of combat flying, but she also understood the military's need for predictable, manageable officers. "Lydia," Martinez said, using her first name in a way that was meant to establish trust, "help me understand something. Your performance evaluations are exemplary. Your flight records are outstanding. Your fellow pilots respect your abilities. So why do your superiors keep recommending you for fitness evaluations?" Castellanos considered her answer carefully. The honest response would be that her superiors were more concerned with career advancement and risk management than with winning wars or saving lives. But honesty had never been particularly useful in situations like this. "I think there's sometimes a disconnect between what the mission requires and what the regulations allow," she said finally. Martinez nodded. "And you feel you should prioritize mission requirements over regulatory compliance?" "I feel I should prioritize American lives over paperwork, even when that means disobeying direct orders." "I've never disobeyed a direct order. I've made tactical decisions in fluid situations that some people have chosen to interpret as insubordination." Martinez made a note on her pad. "Tell me about the SEALs incident." Castellanos had told this story so many times that she could recite it from memory, but she walked through it again. The radio call, the tactical assessment, the decision to engage, the successful outcome. With each telling, it sounded more routine and less heroic, which was exactly how she preferred it. The SEALs wrote letters commending your actions, Martinez observed. They weren't in the debriefing room. No, they weren't, but they were in the valley. They sat in silence for a moment. Through the window, Castellanos could see the flight line, where A-10s were being prepared for the day's missions. Other pilots were walking toward their aircraft, going through pre-flight checklists, preparing to do the same job she'd been doing for 8 months. The difference was that they would do it carefully, by the book, with appropriate authorization and minimal risk to their careers. "Lydia, I'm going to clear you for full duty," Martinez said finally. "Your psychological profile is well within normal parameters for a combat pilot. If anything, you're handling the stress better than most." Castellanos felt a wave of relief she hadn't realized she'd been holding back. "Thank you, ma'am. But I'm also going to make a recommendation to your squadron commander." The relief evaporated. "What kind of recommendation?" "That you be considered for squadron leadership positions. You're a natural leader, whether your superiors want to admit it or not. The question is whether you're going to lead from within the system or outside it." As Castellanos walked back to the flight line, Martinez's words echoed in her mind. Leadership positions meant more responsibility, more oversight, more opportunities to clash with people who valued process over results. But it also meant more influence, more ability to shape how missions were conducted, more power to protect the people who depended on close air support. The choice, as always, came down to whether she was willing to fight the system from within or continue fighting it from the outside. Looking at her, waiting in its revetment, she realized the answer had never really been in doubt. She was a fighter. It was what she did best. 2 weeks later, the call came at 4:30 hours, dragging Castellanos from deep sleep into the harsh fluorescent reality of military emergency. Master Sergeant Davidson's voice carried the particular urgency, reserved for situations that had gone beyond merely bad into genuinely catastrophic. "Captain, we need you airborne in 15 minutes, full combat load." Castellanos was already pulling on her flight suit. "What's the situation?" "Special Operations Team is trapped in the Coast Province. Heavy contact with Taliban forces. They need immediate close air support." She was running toward the flight line before Davidson finished speaking, her mind already shifting into the focused clarity that came with genuine emergency. This wasn't a routine patrol or a planned strike. This was American soldiers dying while she wasted time with questions. Santos was waiting by the aircraft with a ground crew that moved with practiced efficiency. External fuel tanks were being checked, ordnance was being loaded, and the APU was already spinning up. Her A-10 would be carrying a full combat load, 1,174 rounds of 30 ammunition, 2 AGM-65 Maverick missiles, and 4 Mark 82 500-pound bombs. "What do we know about the target area?" Castellanos asked Santos while stepping into her harness. "Grid coordinates put them in the Spira district, about 40 clicks southeast of Fob Salerno. Rough terrain, lots of places to hide." Castellanos nodded, her hands moving through pre-flight checks with muscle memory developed over thousands of hours. Oil pressure, hydraulics, flight controls, weapons systems, everything green. The A-10 was ready to hunt. "Hawkeye 2-1, this is Tower. You are cleared for takeoff. Winds light and variable, ceiling unlimited. Good hunting." She taxied to the active runway, ran through her final checks, and pushed the throttles forward. The twin General Electric TF-34 engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, and the heavily loaded began its takeoff roll. Even with full fuel and ordnance, the aircraft broke ground in less than 4,000 feet, one of the many reasons she loved flying it. As she climbed toward her cruising altitude, the radio crackled with updates from the Joint Terminal Attack Controller on the ground. "Hawkeye 2-1, this is Chaos 6. We have 12 Special Operations personnel surrounded by approximately 100 Taliban fighters in a valley approximately 2 clicks north of Spira. They are taking heavy fire and requesting immediate close air support. 100 Taliban fighters, 12 special operations soldiers. The math was even worse than the SEALs situation, and this time there was no high ground for the Americans to use as defensive position. They were trapped in a valley with superior numbers closing in from all directions. Chaos 6 Hawkeye 2-1, I'm 20 minutes out. Can you mark your position? Affirmative, marking with infrared strobe. Castellanos pushed her aircraft harder, climbing to 15,000 feet and pushing her airspeed to just below the A-10's maximum. At this altitude, she could see the Hindu Kush mountains stretching away in all directions, their peaks catching the early morning light like broken glass. Somewhere below in that maze of valleys and ridges, 12 Americans were fighting for their lives. She switched to the frequency used by close air support controllers and keyed her mic. Any station, this is Hawkeye 2-1 with 1,200 rounds 30 mic, 2 Mavericks and 4 Mark 82s. Looking for work in the Spira area. Hawkeye 2-1, this is Chaos 6, we need you now. The hostiles have us surrounded and are closing in. We're taking casualties. Casualties. The word hit Castellanos like a physical blow. Somewhere below, American soldiers were bleeding and dying while she flew through clean mountain air. She pushed the throttles forward until the engines were screaming, trading fuel economy for speed. Chaos 6, I'm 15 minutes out. Hold tight. But 15 minutes was a lifetime in combat, and they all knew it. When Castellanos finally reached the target area, the scene below looked like something from a medieval siege. The Special Operations Team had taken cover in a cluster of stone buildings at the center of the valley, while Taliban fighters moved through the surrounding terrain in coordinated assault groups. Muzzle flashes sparkled from dozens of positions, and she could see tracer rounds arcing toward the Americans' position like deadly fireworks. Chaos 6 Hawkeye 2-1 is on station. I have eyes on your position. Can you talk me onto targets? Hawkeye 2-1, we have hostiles approaching from the north, approximately 200 meters from our position. Large group, maybe 30 fighters. Castellanos rolled her aircraft into a steep diving attack, lining up on the northern approach. Through her targeting system, she could see the Taliban fighters moving in bounds toward the buildings, using cover and concealment with the skill of experienced guerrilla fighters. These weren't the scattered insurgents she'd faced in the other valley. These were hardened veterans who knew how to fight and weren't easily intimidated. At 8,000 feet, she triggered her GAU-8 cannon. The stream of depleted uranium rounds walked through the Taliban position like the finger of an angry god, turning fighters into mist and cover into rubble. Secondary explosions bloomed as ammunition and grenades detonated, and the surviving fighters scattered toward whatever cover they could find. But there were too many of them. Even as she pulled up from her strafing run, she could see other groups moving toward the Americans from different directions. The Taliban had planned this carefully, positioning themselves to attack from multiple angles while maintaining escape routes through the surrounding ridges. Good hits, Hawkeye 2-1. Chaos 6's voice carried desperate relief. We've got more hostiles moving in from the east and south. Can you hit them? Castellanos was already turning, lining up for her second attack run. But as she rolled inverted and pulled the aircraft into another dive, she realized the fundamental problem. There were too many targets and not enough ammunition. Even with a full combat load, she couldn't kill 100 fighters before they overran the Americans' position. She needed help, and she needed it immediately. Any station supporting Chaos 6, this is Hawkeye 2-1. I need additional close air support at these coordinates immediately. Multiple targets, danger close to friendly positions. The response came from Bagram Air Base, and the voice belonged to Lieutenant Colonel Morrison. Hawkeye 2-1, this is Falcon Actual. No additional aircraft are available at this time. Complete your mission and return to base. No additional aircraft. Complete your mission and return to base. The bureaucratic language couldn't disguise what Morrison was really saying. The 12 special operations soldiers trapped in that valley weren't worth the risk of committing additional resources. Castellanos felt something cold and terrible settle in her chest. She looked down at the valley, where American soldiers were dying while their own command structure abandoned them to preserve aircraft and avoid political complications. The Taliban fighters were regrouping for another assault, and she was running low on ammunition. That's when she made the decision that would define the rest of her career, and possibly her life. Instead of returning to base, she keyed her radio and transmitted on the emergency frequency that every military aircraft in theater monitored. Mayday, mayday, mayday. Any U.S. aircraft in the vicinity of Spira, this is Hawkeye 2-1. I have 12 Americans trapped and under heavy fire. I need immediate assistance. The response was immediate and came from multiple sources. Marine A-10 Hornets returning from a mission in Helmand Province, an Air Force B-1B bomber conducting a routine patrol, and 2 Army Apache helicopters conducting training exercises near Fob Salerno. Hawkeye 2-1, this is Devil 2-7. Marine Hornets 2 aircraft, inbound your position with mixed ordnance. Hawkeye 2-1, Bone 5-1. B-1 bomber with full load 10 minutes out. Hawkeye 2-1, Nightmare 3-6. 2 Apache 5 minutes out. Morrison's voice cut through the radio chatter like a blade. All stations, this is Falcon Actual. Cease operations in the Spira area immediately. Return to base. But it was too late. The Marines were already diving toward the valley, their FA-18 screaming down from 20,000 feet with 500-pound bombs and 20 cannon fire. The Apache helicopters appeared over the southern ridge like mechanical angels, their 30 chain guns already spooling up for engagement. Castellanos coordinated the attack with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony. She talked the Marines onto the eastern approach, where Taliban fighters were preparing to assault the Americans' position. She guided the B-1 bomber toward the largest concentration of enemy fighters in the northern valley. She directed the Apache to patrol the western escape routes, cutting off the Taliban's withdrawal. For 20 minutes, the valley became a killing ground as American aircraft methodically destroyed every Taliban position within 2 kilometers of the trapped Special Operations team. When the shooting stopped, the silence was absolute except for the crackling of fires and the distant sound of helicopter rotors as a medical evacuation team arrived to collect the wounded Americans. All 12 Special Operations soldiers survived. The Taliban unit that had trapped them was completely destroyed. And Captain Lydia, Reaper, Castellanos was facing a court-martial for disobeying direct orders and unauthorized coordination of combat operations. The court-martial proceedings at Bagram Air Base drew attention from military personnel across Afghanistan and from senior officers at the Pentagon who had been watching Castellanos' career with interest. The charges were serious: disobeying direct orders, unauthorized use of emergency frequencies, and coordination of combat operations without proper authority. The prosecution, led by Major Thompson from the Staff Judge Advocate's Office, presented a case built around military discipline and the importance of following orders in combat situations. Thompson was a by-the-book officer who genuinely believed that allowing individual commanders to make unauthorized decisions would lead to chaos and unnecessary casualties. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court," Thompson said during his opening statement, "military discipline exists for a reason. When individual officers begin making decisions based on their personal judgment rather than established procedures and direct orders, the entire command structure breaks down. Captain Castellanos may have had good intentions, but good intentions are not sufficient justification for insubordination." The defense was handled by Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Kim, a decorated JAG officer who had volunteered to represent Castellanos after learning about the case. Kim understood both military law and military necessity, and she had built her defense around a simple premise. Sometimes following orders meant letting American soldiers die. The prosecution wants you to believe this case is about military discipline, Kim said in her opening statement. But this case is actually about military leadership. When Captain Castellanos heard that 12 American soldiers were trapped and dying, she had a choice: follow procedures and let them die, or take action and save their lives. She chose to save lives, and every one of those 12 soldiers is alive today because of that choice. The prosecution called witnesses who testified about the importance of military hierarchy, the dangers of unauthorized operations, and the need for centralized command and control. The defense called the 12 Special Operations soldiers who had been trapped in the valley, and their testimony was devastating to the prosecution's case. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, the senior enlisted man on the trap team, described the situation they had faced in the valley. "Ma'am, we were taking casualties and running out of ammunition. Without Captain Castellanos coordinating that air support, we would all be dead. She saved our lives, and I'll be grateful to her for the rest of my life." Captain James Mitchell, the team leader, was even more direct. Captain Castellanos did what any competent officer should do in that situation. She saw American soldiers in trouble and she fixed the problem. If that's insubordination, then I'm guilty of it too. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source: Brigadier General Patricia Hayes, who had flown unannounced from Kandahar to testify on Castellanos' behalf. Hayes was a legend in the Air Force, a former F-16 pilot who had commanded fighter squadrons in Iraq and Afghanistan, and was known for her no-nonsense approach to military leadership. "I've been watching Captain Castellanos' career for the past 2 years," Hayes testified. "She is exactly the kind of officer the Air Force needs more of: competent, aggressive, and completely focused on mission accomplishment. The charges against her are an embarrassment to military leadership and a disservice to every soldier who has benefited from close air support." The court-martial lasted 3 days, and the panel of officers deliberated for 4 hours before reaching their verdict. Colonel James Rivera, the presiding officer, read the findings in a voice that carried no emotion. "On the charge of disobeying direct orders, we find the defendant not guilty. On the charge of unauthorized use of emergency frequencies, we find the defendant not guilty. On the charge of unauthorized coordination of combat operations, we find the defendant not guilty." The courtroom erupted in applause from the dozens of military personnel who had packed the gallery to show support for Castellanos. But Rivera wasn't finished. "However, this court wishes to make a statement regarding the circumstances that led to these charges. Military discipline and proper procedures exist for valid reasons, and individual officers cannot be allowed to make autonomous decisions without regard for established command structures. Captain Castellanos, while your actions in this case were ultimately successful, you placed yourself and other personnel at unnecessary risk by failing to follow proper procedures." Kim stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, request permission to respond to the court's statement." Rivera nodded. "Your Honor, with respect, proper procedures in this case would have resulted in the deaths of 12 American soldiers. Captain Castellanos followed the most important procedure of all. She protected American lives. Everything else is just paperwork." As the court session ended, Castellanos was surrounded by well-wishers and supporters, but she felt strangely empty. She had been vindicated, but nothing had really changed. The same officers who had brought charges against her were still in command, still making decisions based on risk management rather than mission accomplishment. Outside the courthouse, General Hayes approached her with an offer that would change everything. "Captain, how would you feel about a transfer to a different kind of assignment? Something that would let you use your skills without quite so much bureaucratic oversight." Castellanos looked at the general with new interest. "What kind of assignment, ma'am?" Special Operations Command is looking for experienced close air support pilots to work directly with their teams. It would mean less time dealing with squadron politics and more time doing what you do best. For the first time in months, Castellano smiled. When do I start? 6 months later, Captain Lydia Castellanos was flying missions that officially didn't exist, supporting operations that weren't on any published schedule, protecting soldiers whose names would never appear in any after-action reports. Her new assignment with the 24th Special Tactics Squadron took her to places that weren't on most maps, working with teams that answered to commanders whose rank insignia were often classified. The work was more dangerous than anything she had done in conventional squadrons, but it was also more purposeful. Every mission had clear objectives, defined success criteria, and commanders who understood that rules of engagement were guidelines, not suicide pacts. When American soldiers were in trouble, her job was simple: fix the problem, using whatever means necessary. She was based at Bagram, but she spent most of her time at forward operating bases scattered across Afghanistan's most dangerous provinces. Her A-10 was modified with enhanced communications equipment that let her coordinate directly with special operations teams on the ground, bypassing the layers of command structure that had caused so much frustration in her previous assignment. The aircraft also carried different ordnance loads, customized for the specific requirements of special operations missions. Instead of general-purpose bombs and standard ammunition, she flew with precision guide,